Alrighty, so this is the beginning of the afternoon session, and the first talk is Michael Dennin from UC Irvine, a model for free will. There's a short bio on Michael. Michael Dennin earned his AB from Princeton University and his MA and PhD in 1995 from the University of California, Santa Barbara. He held a postdoctoral position at the University of California, Los Angeles. He is an Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellow and a Research Corporation Cottrell Scholar. Professor Dennin's main research interest is systems that exhibit emergent properties. These include the behavior of complex fluids such as foam and sand, as well as the complex dynamics of biological systems. Professor Dennin is well known for popularizing science for the public. He has appeared on a number of television programs, including Spider-Man Tech, Batman Tech, Star Wars Tech, and Ancient Aliens. He has a book with Franciscan Media on science and religion entitled Divine Science, Finding Reason at the Heart of Science. If you haven't read this book, it's really, really excellent, by the way. Professor Dennin is Dean of the Division of Undergraduate Education and Vice Provost of Teaching and Learning at UC Irvine.
So thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Chris and Dan for inviting me. There's the obvious first question. Did any of us have a choice to come here? Or are we just here because our molecules obeyed the laws of physics and the inputs they experience made us come here, right? This has been really, in my mind, one of the core human questions throughout history is, do we have any choices or is everything predetermined? It's happened, it's in the Greek myths, it's in science, it's in theology, it's all over the place. And I think part of it comes from kind of that deep conflict between the strong sense that we do make choices at various times, but also the very clear knowledge that we can't choose to do anything we want, right? Our choice is not unlimited. I cannot choose at this moment by an act of will to fly and levitate. It's not going to happen. I can choose to go get back on an airplane and I'll fly that way. And so it's, I think, a core fundamental human question. I'm also fascinated by it personally because we were just finishing a conversation over there about the problem of evil. And in my mind, the problem of evil is probably the biggest stumbling block for believing in a loving God. And it's one of the things that probably most causes people to question and leave the faith. So that is why I'm not talking on the problem of evil, because it's too hard. I am not that smart. I once heard physics defined as the problems that are just hard enough to be interesting and just easy enough to be solved. So I like to stick there. But I think for atheists, there is not a good enough acknowledgement that free will is the biggest stumbling block to being an atheist. If you really, really accept that free will exists, I will argue sort of hopefully in the next 30 to 40 minutes that it's very hard not to believe in some form of God. You might necessarily not believe in the Christian God or the Catholic God, but there is something more. You can't be a physicalist or a materialist or a naturalist or whatever we want to call it anymore. There is something more than physical reality. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about, there are some philosophers who fully commit to physicalism and no free will. And I try and listen sometimes to their podcasts or their talks, and I find it very humorous because it's hard to talk about a world where humans don't have choice. Then we don't have responsibility, the whole fabric of society falls apart. Some of you may know the rock band Rush. It's a Canadian rock band. I am a huge fan, one of the few in the world, but they have a great song called Free Will. And there's a line in it, even if you refuse to choose, you still have made a choice. And that's one of the other problems with free will. If it's not there, it's unclear why we're all sitting here talking and thinking about science and faith. So that's where I'm coming from this. I think it's one of the most fundamental human questions. I think it's the biggest stumbling block for atheists, and I don't think we call them to task enough on this issue of free will. And in this talk, I ran into one of my classic problems lately. I've discovered the talks I'm trying to give, I used to stick very strongly with the idea of one idea per talk, and that is about all a human can process. And now I've noticed multiple ideas are slipping in, and it's even worse. They're really best understood in parallel. I have not figured out how to give a parallel talk yet, and I don't think most of us have figured out how to listen to a parallel talk. But in the spirit of transhumanism, I suspect my kids might be able to do that because they both look at a phone, watch TV, and talk to a friend. So they are figuring out parallel processing in ways I'm not. So instead of an outline of my talk, I've decided to tell you what the elements of the talk were. So one is, I want to talk a little bit about some different views of free will, particularly two that I find almost compelling from a purely physical, materialistic point of view, that understanding where I think they fall short is really critical to understanding kind of this larger question of why it can't be physical. I also want to talk about, and English fails me here, what I'm going to call the difference between decisions and acts of will. I used to call, if you read my book, I call it the difference between decisions and choice. That seemed a little too confusing, so I've moved to acts of will. I don't know what word I'm going to use today while I talk, so I'll try to be clear. And also, the real argument in the end for the role of and the existence of the non-physical if you're going to take free will seriously. So the two sort of ideas out there on free will that I found interesting and fascinated me, and one of the people have been mentioned already, Sean Carroll, in his book, The Big Picture, really takes an interesting stab at explaining free will using emergence and what he calls poetic naturalism. And you'll see both of these use emergence, and that's why I feel vaguely qualified, though I'm not a philosopher, as you heard in my bio, I study emergence. And so I feel vaguely qualified to critique their use of it in these cases. And if you haven't read it, basically, he uses the word poetic naturalism to say, look, you have to use the physics or science appropriate to the level you're studying. So when you study fundamental particles, you use quantum theories, you use quantum field theory. When you study humans, you use human scale sort of ideas. And free will turns out to be one of them, and I'll say more about that. And what really becomes unclear as you work through his argument, I think the stumbling point, is this idea of responsibility and limits on free will. He also states an interesting thing in this book, and he quotes some work, now I'm forgetting the name of who was working on it, but he questions, okay, if there really is something more than the physical universe, how would the non-physical ever interact with it? Like, sort of by definition, the non-physical and the physical shouldn't be able to interact. And since you can't make a model for that and you can't explain it, his conclusion is therefore nothing exists except the physical. Not a very satisfying logical argument from one perspective, but an interesting challenge. And that's why in the end, you see, I actually go to the effort of proposing a model of free will that I've actually talked with some of my friends in the philosophy departments, and I agree it's not a scientific model because it's not testable. But what I would argue is it's a logically consistent, and it meets the definitions of models that Sean Carroll would be looking for. It can explain how the non-physical and the physical interact. So it deals with that counter-argument. The other person, and I always hope, I haven't met her, so I'm hoping I'm pronouncing her name right, is Dennin T. Ismail, and she's a philosopher, now at Columbia, was in Arizona, and has, I think, a very, very interesting read, How Physics Makes Us Free. This comes the closest in my mind to explaining free will as an emergent property of physical systems. But it does fall short, I think, but it has some interesting ideas that helped me refine my views from a non-physical point of view. So I think it's worth talking about. And one of the things really is this idea of the center of will, right? That sense that we're an I, that we're acting. Where does that center of will really come from? And there's some interesting arguments about emergence that I think help with this, and actually have a lot to do with what Stephen was saying about foundational levels and order emerging and where that emerges from. So these are two physical models of free will that I will argue fall short. But we do still need to define, in my mind, this other concept of decision versus act of will or choice. English, like I said, is tough here, but I think we have an intuitive idea of what both of these are at some level. You're in an initial state. I tried to get away from the spherical cow and made a square cow model. That's for the physicists in the audience. And you're going to turn from this state to a state A or a state B. Now, it could be that one of state A and B is actually still the initial state. So maybe you're hungry and you're making a decision whether to eat or not eat. And so state A is eating, and so you're not going to be hungry. State B, you decide to stay hungry. Or it might be you're hungry, you're definitely going to eat, and you're deciding between salad and cookies. Okay? And not really a choice. You know you're going to eat the cookies, but you pretend. And something happens there, right? You have to pick the two states. And I'm using the word decision for what I think is every process that happens according to physical law. I would argue that everything that's determined by physical law, whether it's probabilistic or deterministic, is ultimately automatic and algorithmic. Those are the decisions that your brain is just making all the time without an act of will, right? The oxygen level changes in the room, your heart rate and lungs change without you having to think at all, right? Your brain is, at least in part, very much a decision-making system that doesn't need you to intervene in sort of any way that's an action. In contrast, we all, I think, intuitively know when we've made a choice, when we've made an act of will. I think the most, interesting and amazing example to me are people who actually either at the extreme level get over an addiction, they reach that point in their life, and whether it's from the influence of friends or families or just hitting rock bottom, they make that choice. They make the act of will to do something different, and then that turns out to be a series of acts of will, right? As you retrain your system and the automatic responses. For me, one of the more recent sort of just personal examples was the act of will to actually exercise. And I know that's a hard choice for me. I know it falls off. So one choice I made was to pay for a personal trainer. Because I knew I now created some conditions. I'm really cheap. I don't like paying for things I don't use. I feel real guilty and embarrassed if I pay someone and I don't show up. I now show up regularly, and the act of will became easier, right? So it's almost switched from act of will to automatic. So I think it's really important as humans to understand we do both of these. But I think we intuitively understand that we're making these choices, these acts of wills, and that's why I think it's really a challenge, an interesting sort of space from a theological point of view. Okay, now can that be explained purely by physical materialistic theory, when almost by definition, anything materialistic is going to be in the top category? And what has happened, and Sean Carroll and J.T. Ismail do it in slightly different ways, is people try and rely on emergence and make claims from there. And that's where I'm going to kind of put hopefully a damper on that. But I do want to revisit this question of probabilistic decisions, because it's the thing that most often I think is thrown out there with not a lot of thought. Personally, for a long time, I believe, well, quantum mechanics, that's the solution to free will, right? We have quantum mechanics, it's probabilistic, so therefore, obviously, it can make free will. But I thought about it a little more carefully from the physics and also some other things I've read, and I realized, okay, here's the classic quantum mechanical choice or decision, right? Particles going through a slit, the two-slit experiment for electrons. There's really no acts of will in this. It's probabilistic, but it's all decisions by the way I describe decisions, right? The laws of physics all determine, whether, okay, we don't look at which slit they go through, so we get an interference pattern. We look at which slit they go through, and they go through a slit, and we don't. But there's been no choice of a slit as an act of will. Likewise, take classical probabilistic things. Should I eat cookies, right? If I'm rolling dice to determine if I'm eating cookies, it's still not an act of will, right? There is no sort of inherentness about probabilistic things creating acts of will. What they do, and I think this is the important thing, and it was a thread today in all the talks that kind of were before me that I really appreciated, is they create a space where it's almost impossible from a scientific experimental point of view to determine if something was an act of will or a decision. Okay? So it creates the space for free will to occur. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at the quantum microscopic world. So what causes a particle nucleus to decay? I picked this question because I'm like near Los Alamos. Would anyone like to hazard an answer to this question? I just made everyone in the audience nervous. Steve.
Well, quantum mechanically, there's nothing physical cause ascribable. I mean, that made it decay at that point.
Right, yeah, it's an interesting situation. Our laws of physics in this case just say it will decay possibly at some point, and when it does, we say, wow, that was the point it decayed, right? The laws of physics in this case are truly very probabilistic, right? And the cause is that the relevant sort of forces in quantum field theory allows for a decay, and it allows for it with some probability. If you look at any single individual decay, because it's allowed to occur with some probability, one measurement of one decay is not a determination of a probability. You could not tell me from an experiment if that really just happened, consistent with the laws of physics, or if at that moment that nucleus has some free will and chose, now's the moment I'm going to decay. And that's kind of what I mean by we really can't scientifically distinguish, but if it is purely physical, it's not an act of will. It's just as Steve described it. It's just an event that happened because it's allowed by the laws of physics. And the same thing happens at the macroscopic level, largely because of entropy, right? You have these macro states of temperature and pressure, and what's really nice if we're trying to think about free will is in the macroscopic world, there's gajillions of microstates for the most common macrostates. That's kind of the point of entropy. And the role of entropy creates the same level for an individual act. It's very hard to know if it was an act of will or not. Because a lot of times people try to make the argument that the only way we would measure an act of will is if it violated the laws of physics. And what I hope I just convinced you of is because so many of our foundational principles are probabilistic, a single act of will is not by definition a measurement of a probability, and therefore you can't determine if it violated physical laws and was an act of will or was just a decision. So let's suppose we want to try and get a model of free will that is just physical. So I'll talk a little bit about Sean Carroll's description first. And he basically just throws it out there as a statement. At the human level, we clearly have choice. Therefore, choice is part of the right description of the human level. You can see right away where that's a little unsatisfying. And then he just kind of quotes, well, we're complex and it must emerge. And there's a sort of a niceness to that. You feel like you can start with it. But then he goes on to talk about the cases that are well documented where whether it's for chemical reasons, brain damage, other biological things, you can actually see a change in the amount of, quote, choice or action an individual can take, right? We actually know we can lose our agency in the world, right? It's not just constrained under normal conditions, but we have to be honest about the fact that we can lose it. And this is where his description starts to fail and becomes unsatisfactory, because he makes the statement, well, we have choice normally because we're so complex, we don't understand where it's coming from, so we might as well call it choice. And in the cases where it gets eliminated, since we understood that what was going on, that's why we don't see there being choice. And to me, that is just punting the question down the road, right? Anytime you use a sentence, well, we don't have enough knowledge, therefore we'll describe it as choice, that's as bad as using a God of the gaps on the other side, right? To say we don't have enough knowledge, so God did it. So I think his version fails, and he's trying very hard to retain his physicalism, right? Which is not necessarily an inconsistent view. I mean, it's possible to be a physicalist, but retain free will. And I would argue you have to give up free will if you're going to be a very, very strict physicalist. Now, JT does something a little interesting. What she focuses on is this sort of center of will. So we have this picture of the choice being made, and then we look into it, and I like this because as a physicist, we love separation of timescales, right? Particularly those of us who study foams, and emergent properties, right? It's at a new length scale, it's at a new time scale. And she talks a lot about how the internal processes, our memories, our values, our goals, our beliefs, are operating on a separate time scale and act incredibly quickly in those moments of choice, almost disconnected from the external stimuli and influences that we're going to make a choice about. And this was something I had to really think a lot about because I found it very appealing at first. right? And the idea is that there really is this center of will that's emergent. And she uses a lot of interesting analogies where she talks about companies effectively having choice. Right? Companies make decisions as a company, as a collective. Nations, cities, these collectives as great examples of emergence of choice. And this is why I think, Steve, your comments about order always coming from higher order was actually critical. I realized all her examples of emergence of choice was in systems where the fundamental unit was a human, right? So you could only have choice as an emergent property if it was built in already at the foundational level. So choice, to me, has to be somehow as fundamental as charge, mass, whatever other properties you want. And maybe mass is not as fundamental, but we'll go charge and spin, I don't know, right? It really has to be a core property of a thing. So where do you get active will as a core property if it's not going to emerge from underlying physical processes? And again, I want to sort of think about and talk about other things where we know emergence happens. Entropy is a good example. It's an emergent property because you have a collection of many particles and now you have entropy. And I love the quote from Landau and Lifshitz, which is, entropy is a new law of physics that applies to systems of large particles. It does not imply any individual particle is violating the existing laws of physics. It's just when you have a collection of them, there's a new law that doesn't exist when you only have one. But if you think about it, there's a sort of a continuity of character there, of being sort of rule-based, predictive, algorithmic. It has characters, that I think Feynman was the one who wrote the book called Character of Physical Law, I believe. Was it Feynman or Schrodinger? One of them wrote a book, Character of Physical Law. And it has those same characteristics. This act of will is radically different, and it's an example, philosophers that I talk to, the reason they don't like free will is it's basically unlimited power. If you really think of an act of will, it does not care about a single law of physics, possibly. You're just going to make a choice and do something. So how do we reconcile that? Where might a property that's fundamental, like an act of will, that can't be part of the physical world, come from? And a lot of what I talk about in my book is this idea of the fullness of reality. And God being the fullness of reality, and our goal, God clearly exists, and our goal is to understand who God is. And what our relationship with God is and how to behave. And so that means there is this fullness of reality. I'm back to spherical cows. That's yellow. And physical reality is part of that. And if we take this as our starting assumption, free will becomes a lot easier. Because acts of will make perfect sense as part of the non-physical reality. And in fact, it is one of the core characteristics of God. I always start my talks, usually when I'm talking to a very general audience, of I know God exists, I know God loves me, and I know God wants to have relationships with me. God's love is probably one of the most foundational characteristics. But the fact that God is really the only true, pure act of will out there. God does whatever God wants, right? Acts of will are foundationally part of that non-physical and foundationally part of God. And the beauty is of being a human, we bridge, because we have a soul, the physical and the non-physical. And the fact that we're not God explains why our free will is not unlimited. So that's the starting point, okay, of what I thought about. And then I'm like, so where is our free will coming from? And I realized for me, the natural way to think about it is at the boundary. If I have two things, physical, non-physical, they have a boundary. A lot of what I think about in my work is what the boundary conditions do to things. So imagine there's our picture, fullness of God. This is now just me in my current state, not all of physical reality. I have a choice to make, and I either end up in state A or state B. And that act of will to make the real choice is, I would argue, deeply connected simply with that shape of that boundary between me and the non-physical. That is how true act of will, that is how I engage with the grace of God. That's how I engage with the soul. That is, to me, the soul and our free will are intimately linked. Without a soul, we don't have free will. And of course, I had to throw one picture of foam in here because that's what I study. And I was really excited that Stephen talked about crystalline structures. Because, you can also use bubbles, not just ball bearings, and it'll work in your example. We can talk. And I can send you pictures of hexagons. But, a foam itself is either a liquid or a solid by the natural definitions of solids hold their shape and liquids flow. But every molecule in there is in a fluid state. So it has an emergent property. It can be a solid or a liquid. And that property depends on the state of the boundary. And this is my analogy to where you can now make choices, never violate the laws of physics, because all you're doing is changing from one allowed state to another, but you're doing it through a true act of will that has nothing to do with the laws of physics. In my experiment, I take this boundary, and if I don't move it, this is a solid. If I move it, it's suddenly a liquid. I haven't changed the laws of physics. I haven't violated the laws of physics. I've just changed the boundary condition. And I've changed it with something that is truly fundamentally different than the foam itself. All the stuff outside the foam, the apparatus and all the equipment, has fundamental properties that the foam doesn't have. So I really love this metaphor and analogy. So the core elements of the model as I propose it are, one is there is an emergent physical property. This is the only thing I haven't mentioned yet, and I'm going to really get to in my last slide. And that is having a physical system with the right physical properties that it can actually support a soul, or that it can actually interface with the non-physical. And that, to me, that is the Genesis story combined with evolution and the theism, I already forgot the word, sorry. Theism as evolution. Did I get it right? Theistic evolution, right? If you look at the statements by the Catholic Church, it's very clear, we talk about that the physical body evolved, but at some point, God did give us our soul. That was a separate thing, okay? And this is very consistent with the model that I'm talking about, which is at some point in the molding out of clay, right, a human, God then breathed a soul into. And that actually implies that we are a vessel that can hold a soul, right? It seems a natural implication. And what is the emergent property that allows for that is the structure of our brain. And it also addresses Sean Carroll's concern, because I would argue that when there is sufficient brain damage, and this is something I think would be really interesting to talk to theologians and philosophers, because it's a new thought, it could be totally crazy. When there is brain damage and it looks like we're losing some degree of our active will, I would argue we're not losing our soul. Our soul is that fundamental connection and gift from God, but the interface is starting to fail. The interface to the physical world, not the interface to God. Right? And that is, I think, a very interesting thing, and it goes exactly to the transhumanism discussion we heard earlier today. Right? A lot of talk about the computers, the focus is, they can hold our memories. But are our memories really us? Are our memories really our center of will? And is a computer architecture the right interface, the right interaction between the non-physical and the physical to hold a soul, or for a soul to interact with the physical world through? So there's a lot here that I think this model gives language to explore further. So like I said, it's hard to think of this as not really a scientific model, because I can't really do tests on it, but I think it's a contextual model that allows us to talk about free will in very interesting ways. So the act of will itself is a property of the non-physical, but it can now interact with the physical because there's a boundary. And we know that you can interact across boundaries, two things that are totally different. My foam example. So that answers Sean Carroll's concern about the non-physical and the physical interacting. It does not require an emergence in a physical system of acts of will, but it does tell us, as Stephen talked about earlier, once you foundationally have an entity that can act with free will, okay, it could be conceivable that there's a higher level when we form organizations and corporations that you see a similar emergence of choice. I would argue not a soul, it's a different emergence, but you can now see when you have units that have free will, emergence coming out of that in ways that JT talks about. And then finally, I already talked about this. The changes in the physical system really are changes in the interface, and that addresses Sean Carroll's question. So I talked about my foam analogy. I have another analogy that came out of reading JT, and I want to mention, for those of you who like and have time to watch TV, a lighthearted look at the apocalypse and transhumanism is this TV show called Upload that just came out on, I think, Hulu. First season is over. Basic principle is we've gotten enough computer power that when you die, you can be uploaded into the equivalent of a heaven. But they, in a very clever way, they look at a lot of the things that can go wrong with this. And there's some very interesting conversations between those who believe in heaven and a soul who don't want to be uploaded and those who want to be uploaded. And there's also a whole bunch of stuff about, like I said, it's a mild apocalypse. The wealthy still eat real food and everybody else is eating printed food. And Google and Oscar Mayer have merged. So the food printers are Oscar Mayer and Google. So it's an amusing look, but it actually asks some interesting questions. And what I realized is whenever we use the analogy of the computer in any of these spaces, whether we're talking about transhumanism, free will, consciousness, storing memories, we make a direct one-to-one connection often between the hardware and the computer and the brain. And we say, the brain is the fundamental reality, and your thoughts and sense of self emerge from it. The computer hardware, that's the reality, right? The ones and zeros, the voltages in the chips and all of that are the reality. The interface, for us, it's our senses, our body. We interface between the rest of the world and our brain. For the computer, it's the screen and the keyboard. And then there's this software stuff, right? If you think about it, the programs we write are kind of a great analogy to my statement of like the non-physical, right? They're the sort of, they don't really have a reality, but they do. They're not exactly the electrical voltages in the computer, but they're how we tell the computer what to do. And so often when people talk about the analogy, they figure if you just have that right hardware in the brain, okay, it's going to interface to the non-physical, and our brain is our source of choice. That's the Sean Carroll version. That's the physicalist version of it, okay? But what I would argue is the brain is just that interface between the non-physical acts of will can only act on the world through the interface of the brain because that's the boundary condition that can be acted across. And it flips what I would say is the model where the core reality is, right? Whether is the core reality your brain and our self emerges, or is the core reality our self, our soul, and once God's evolution reached a point where there was a vessel to hold the soul, God breathed that soul into the vessel and allowed the soul to interact with the physical world around it. So I don't know if this is more confusing or less confusing to people who haven't thought about it, but I think it's a counter to the typical picture of what the computer's doing. And it's a challenge to the transhumanists because it's unclear that simply by putting memories into a computer, you create the right interaction between the non-physical and the physical. So just in closing, some next steps. I've answered the question. I don't think this is testable. It's not a scientific model. It's more of a philosophical, analogy, metaphorical, theological model. But I think the non-physical is real. It has to be real if we actually believe we have choice. I think that's the logical decision we each have to make, unless we don't have free will, in which case you're not going to make a choice and your atoms will just believe one of these or the other. I once made the statement, that if we don't have free will, your atoms just do what they want, and your behavior is just what it is by the atoms. And one of my staff heard the talk and said, so next time I screw up, by the way, it's just my atoms, it's not me. And so there is this sort of core sense that we have free will. I think I'm willing to be open to the fact that physicalism or materialism could lead to free will, but the two best arguments I've seen still fall clearly short in my mind. If you're going to have free will, you have to have the non-physical, even if it's not testable in the traditional scientific sense. So then the question is, are there ways to think about this that go beyond what I just said, that make it almost testable? What would that look like? But I think a part of it has to do with the implications of a model like this. I think it actually has a lot of explanatory power for the deep experiences we have. And explanatory power is not quite predictive power, but I think it's really, really important. And if a model has that, it's not quite scientific, but it's something. So thank you for your time and attention. I think I tried to leave a lot of time for questions, because my other goal is, I have no idea if any of this makes any sense or is any good. So the more questions I get, the better my ideas get. So thank you. Dennin.
How about biology? You know, you have one cell systems that are just membrane, which is kind of like your boundary between one state and another. Does that, I mean, they've been working on that. I mean, I'm not a biologist. They've been working on that problem for a bajillion of years. Does that, you know, any of that might add some into this problem or not?
Not quite that. So when I think about biology, so here's the other thing that I didn't put in this talk. But the other thing I study is pattern formation. And so bifurcations and behaviors in nonlinear system, where you make a transition from one state to another. And thermal convection's the classic example, right? You're never going to get convection rolls just by the random motion of molecules. But if you heat fluid and you put a temperature difference across it that's just big enough, you always get convection rolls. If it's just small enough, you don't, right? So there's a fundamental symmetry breaking change in the system that has to do with the non-equilibrium parameters. And bifurcations can be continuous or they can be discontinuous. And I realized, like, I have a dog, and I'm hard-pressed to think that dog's making any real choices. The dog makes a lot of decisions. The dog is a very, very complex, responsive system to the world around it. And you know, I haven't studied the dog like a biologist, but I don't think it's making true acts of will choice. But again, as I argued, that's hard to think about how you would even measure or decide. And so what I do think, the other piece of this model is when you put the emergence piece on the biological structure getting the right, and again, I can't define for you what the boundary between the physical and non-physical is at the moment, because that's a part of the model that's, you know, hard to think about. But you can imagine there is something in the human brain structure that makes that boundary now have crossed the bifurcation point. And it might be discontinuous. And that's why we're the ones, I mean, if you look at how humans behave in the world, and you look at, there was the slide of, you know, the chimpanzee and the person, right? The things we build, the things we do, our drive, even the horrible things, the acts of violence, the fact that someone pointed out we're the only species that seems to try and destroy ourselves, right? We do behave in ways that are fundamentally different. But to the conference we had in DC on aliens, it also opens up the possibility of rational aliens with a soul, because it's about reaching a certain biological structure, not necessarily, ours isn't necessarily the only one. And so that's how I think about it. And then to your question, the cell membrane and stuff, that's, I think, just everyday boundary condition, interesting physics, that physics of boundaries are something we need to pay more attention to, even just in the physical world. So that is how I think about those two.
So I loved your talk, and just a couple of things. One, this whole idea that you have to have a certain kind of matter, or organization of matter, in order to be able to have a spiritual soul. That's very traditional, but you know, the medieval St. Thomas would have said you have to have apt matter, or materia apta, in order. So you wouldn't have, God would not infuse a soul into a worm, a rational soul. The worm doesn't have the neurological substrate.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I'm reading a book. I haven't finished it. It's not the best written book in the world, but it's by Henry Stapp. Are you familiar with his?
No.
Now, Henry Stapp is now he's in his 90s. I was going to have him write an article for us, but I think it's not realistic. So he's a theoretical physicist at UC Berkeley, and he's written a lot of books on quantum mechanics and free will. And the book I'm reading is called Quantum Theory and Free Will. And he has a model he's developing. I haven't finished how it works. But he makes a point in the early parts of his book that in the traditional understanding of quantum mechanics, there are really two kinds of entities involved. You know, people are trying to run away from that now.
Right.
Not very successfully. But von Neumann goes back to von Neumann, who really has formulated it very clearly, and others after him, that there are two kinds of entities, one of which is physical and is describable by these equations, but the other is the observer, or something about the observer that is not describable and interacts with by making measurements.
Right.
And there's a boundary there. It's called the Heisenberg cut traditionally, a boundary line between them, which is shiftable. But anyway, so he's developing a model that's more detailed. I haven't gotten to the details of that's along these lines. But one of the points he makes very much in the beginning part of his book is that the physicalists are, in a sense, throwing away a lot of what you're trying to explain. When we what is it that we know about the world that our theories of science are trying to explain? Well, yes, it's the measure, where the dials and the pointers are on the equipment. but it's also our subjective experience of the world is actually what we most fundamentally know. Before we do these experiments, we know we have consciousness. We know we have minds, and not just free will, but even consciousness is not, and no one's ever derived that from physics.
Right.
Even consciousness, even your dog's consciousness has consciousness. And that's a part of the thing to be explained by our theories. But people are, like Sean Carroll, are content to simply toss that out the window and say, there's nothing there.
Yeah, don't look at it.
There's nothing there to explain. And so part of our experience is this exercising a power of choice and feelings of moral responsibility and right and wrong. All of that is part of reality, and if our theories can't account for it, they're no good.
Well, and I think that's right. Well, I would say just that if our theories can't account for it, it says to me our theories are good for physical things, they're no good for
they're
that.
only good up to a point. Yeah.
And I'm going to actually have to look at that because my next thing I want to really think about is, well, how might you model this boundary between the physical and the non-physical? And the quantum approach seems to be a very positive one. I'm going to look at that.
But he'll say that I guess in tradition, I don't think he's Catholic, I think he's religious.
Right.
But in Catholic terms, it's the spiritual versus the physical.
Yeah.
He doesn't say it that way, but he would say the non-physical, which he would, I don't know, it was a mind or consciousness or something, is not describable by equations. If one tries to develop physics-like laws for it, you've sort of already just made it a part of the physical.
Exactly. And I think one of the challenges, one of the reasons I went in my book and actually chose for most of the book to use the word fullness of reality, not God, is I think right now it's become a distractor. Kind of like you mentioned, design has become a distractor, Steve, and it's kind of a shame, right? Because sort of all of the language of soul and spiritual is perfectly valid in my opinion and very useful, but I switched to things like active will and non-physical because it doesn't carry any baggage at the moment. Right, and so that's why for this audience, when I know I'm talking to the Society of Catholic Scientists, I can use soul pretty liberally. In some other audiences, just for the rhetorical device, I would use active will. But I think that's exactly right. And then
one of the things, a lot of non-religious people, atheists, or people, I think it's important to explain to them, because to them spiritual may mean like voodoo dolls.
Exactly, right.
And what I always think has to be really hammered home, not just to them, but to Catholics. I've talked to Catholic audiences and I said, what is it that makes us spiritual? And a lot of this tradition has been forgotten by a lot of people. And I explained to the non-religious people, when we say spiritual, we mean reason and free will.
Yep.
So if you believe that there's reason and free will, that's what we mean when we're talking spiritual. So you can not use the word spiritual if it bothers you.
Right, but you redefining and reminding people is great. I have no idea where we are on time.
We're good.
Okay.
We have enough time for questions.
Good. I tried to leave a lot of time for questions because I figured I would inspire them. We'll go there, and then over there. I think I saw hands.
Sounds good.
1, 2, 3.
You've mentioned that you don't think your model is testable, at least the non-physical part of it, but probably this boundary condition, that interface, ought to be amenable to some kinds of tests. Now, one arena that your talk made me think about is children.
Is what?
Well, you said children.
Children.
Oh.
It's children.
Particularly my children. You said about your dog. I should have said about my children, at least before the age of 2 or 3. I mean, we don't think I don't think newborns were making free acts of will or choices, but I believe they have rational souls from the beginning. But at some point in the development of their brains, they develop enough complexity in their brain while they're alive that it gains that ability to interface with the non-physical and then start making things we would consider free choices and we get to assign moral responsibility to them. So it's like this emergent property of being able to interface with the non-physical. It appears to emerge actually during our own development.
No, I think that's exactly right, and that's why I'm very intrigued about the idea. And right now, unfortunately, I'm too busy as an administrator. But how could I get, or could someone get more precise about what does one mean by the interface between the physical and non-physical? Could you actually, as an abstract mathematical concept, think about how you might measure it or characterize it? I mean, I think a lot about, Steve, your talk earlier, how, in a way, how abstract particle physics got when it switched to really just talking about symmetries in many ways. It was a very different mathematical approach that got developed compared to just writing down a differential equation for Newton's laws. And so, I feel like I need to now go back and learn some more math again, because I think that's a space where there may be some interesting ways to get at that, which then might lead to something that is somewhat testable. I think, question there, yeah.
So you talked about quantum uncertainty essentially providing the room for this interface, and you made the statement that one observation is not a measurement of a probability. But in principle, even though it's not practically possible, and I doubt it ever will be, you could write down a wave function for me and derive a probability that I'm going to eat the leftover pizza in my refrigerator when I come home. And in principle, that could be done for thousands or millions of people. You could get an ensemble. And very unlikely things can happen in an ensemble, but now you've relegated human beings to the same kind of basic experimental mechanism that we use for other quantum systems. Does the fact that in principle that could be done provide any philosophical problems?
I don't think it, I think even at that level it doesn't, unless, from the following perspective, okay? I think it does if you're purely a physicalist, right? Because what's more likely to happen in that scenario, if you really were able to build up and practice all of those experiments, is you would either see no event that violated the laws of quantum mechanics, in which point I would still argue you don't know which of those events might have been acts of will. It just means nobody made an act of will that threw the whole distribution out of whack, or nobody made a choice that violated the allowed probabilities. That's all you can conclude at that point, right? But if you actually did get an event, that's something where this theory becomes testable, right, in an interesting way. And so I think, to me, a little bit, that's why maybe going after this interface and where our sense of choice emerges, and which systems they emerge in and which they don't, might be an interesting sort of indirect test. And I have this weird underlying view that somehow God's made the world, sufficiently understandable, but sufficiently not understandable to kind of be this sweet spot that it's not so obvious we're all forced to believe, but it's pretty obvious to those of us who look. I know that sounds weird. So, the other thing about this is, if you found this interface and it was testable, in a weird way, those of us who believe would just believe more, I guess. I don't know. And those who still didn't believe probably still wouldn't be convinced. So, but yeah, that's kind of my expectation of that kind of taking into that stuff. And I think there's like 2 questions over here.
Actually, I was going to comment.
Oh yeah, comment, and then I think there's a question behind
I
you.
was going to comment to the previous person that I've never understood this, that if there was a wave function for a lot of people, who could really practically understand it except God? And we can say in theory we can come up with a wave function, but practically I don't actually think we can do that. So is there practical limitations to that kind of reasoning?
There might be, but one of the things when I think about things like this, I do try personally not to worry about, like if it could be done, even if it's not practical, I do think it's important to think through what the implication of that would be for the way you think about the physical and the non-physical. Because if you don't take a little time to think about it, you could, I think, sort of make the mistake Sean Carroll made, which he just kind of waved his hands and said, we're so complex and in practice we can never know it, therefore we have free will. And it's a little unsatisfying. So you want to think about, okay, what does our lack of knowledge mean in that space? But you're right, you think about it differently, I think, if it's something that can practically never happen than if it's something you can do.
But if it's like my understanding is that if we live in a deterministic universe, there could be a wave function for the whole universe. But meaning does not even have to human beings because we're part of the universe.
Yeah, exactly. So,
philosophical, like abstraction almost.
yeah, I agree. It gets a little less important. Yeah.
I was kind of along the same lines as a few questions ago, but just thinking about like he was talking about like children or even down to like fetuses. As Catholics, we believe they have a soul, but it seemed like you kind of defined the soul as the boundary between the physical and the non-physical, which is also the boundary that free will goes across. Which
No, I'm glad you asked that because I did not try. I tried not to define it that way.
okay.
Right. So one of the things I realized. So if you do buy my book, which is on Amazon, which I didn't bring copies of because I'm not used to flying with them because it's after the pandemic. And luckily Dan recommended it, so I don't have to tell you how great it is. The chapter on free will in there is not nearly as well developed as this talk, which is still not as well developed as I would ultimately hope this will be. But what I realized when you think about what we do know about the brains and brain chemistry and our own ability to make choices, is I kind of divided into our soul is that part of us which is non-physical and a gift from God. So it's firmly sitting there. Our body is our physical, right? So if we are both physical and non-physical, there's obviously a boundary between the two, right? And in my mind, I would place that somewhere in the brain or somehow the structure of the brain, and that boundary can get messed up so that even though we still have a soul, it causes problems for our free will and choices, and that boundary has to grow and emerge. So it is very consistent with the idea that a fetus or a child has a soul, but isn't actually fully an independent agent yet, because the boundary that allows the soul to take those acts of will and have them in the physical world hasn't fully formed yet.
Now, I don't know if this is relevant. It's about the question, what if we made, we could make n copies of a person and then calculate from the wave function.
Right.
And suppose that each person had exactly the same physical state. And then you might be able to calculate, say, his choice of eating cookies, there's a 60% chance each one will eat a cookie and 40% chance to eat the broccoli. And that would sort of put a constraint, because even though it wouldn't tell a particular person, it would say with n, very large, you have to have 60.6 n of them do one and 0.7. But there, again, I'm not sure this is relevant, but there's a theorem that you cannot, God could create n identical systems with identical wave functions, but we could not take you and your wave function and sort of clone you. I think they're called non-clone, anti-cloning.
Oh, that sounds vaguely familiar.
And you can't make copies, even one copy of you in exactly the same physical state. And the argument, I think, is this: if you could do that, physically make such a replica, you could make a very large number of copies of something like an electron with spin. And by doing that, you could actually beat Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and you could measure simultaneously properties you're not supposed to be able to measure simultaneously.
Yeah.
And I think this is also related to what are called the anti-teleportation theorems.
Okay.
So it may be sort of relevant to what you're saying. We could not do such an experiment. It's physically impossible for any person in this world to perform that experiment.
Yeah, no, and that makes sense, and that's another one of those constraints.
What about identical twins?
Well, again, identical twins are...
So you have a fertilized egg and it gets a soul. Which of the twins gets that soul when it splits?
So here is a really great analogy for that I don't know if this is actually a Buddhist belief, but I learned it in my course on self and world religions in the Buddhist section. So take that for what it's worth. It was a course at Princeton, so it must be right? But one other interesting thing that I was reminded of recently when I watched the show Upload, because I'll also self-advertise. I do a podcast. It's fgggbt.com. It has no science and religion, really. It's called Fascinating Gadgets, Gizmos, and Gear-Based Technology. Three of us take movies and pop culture and claim that we can explain how to make that actually work in the real world. Some of what we say is completely silly, and some of what we say is actually good physics and engineering. But talking about upload and souls, it reminded me, you know, there's this analogy of the soul being the flame on a candle, right? And so if you think of the non-physical as God's fullness, right, as a big flame, and you have lots of candles being lit from that, right, those are our individual souls that are part and come from God, but are also our own souls. And so again, imagine a twin at birth. If a flame splits into two flames, which flame is which? And they're both equally a soul. So it's a metaphor, but I think it's a great image for thinking about that non-physical side.
Great. All right, let's thank our...
Thank you.
It's a great talk, and the fact that your model isn't developed yet means that you'll be invited to many other conferences and national conferences in the years ahead.